Chapter 4 of Lotus Buds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alice Jane. Lotus Buds by Amy Wilson CARMICHAEL. Chapter 4. The Photographs. I do not know how they will strike the critical public, but the photos are so much better than we dared to expect that we are grateful and almost satisfied. Of course, they are insipid as compared with the lively originals, but the difficulty was to get them of any truthful sort whatsoever, for the babies regarded the photographer, the kindest and mildest of men, with the gravest suspicion. And the moment he appeared, little faces, all animation before, would stiffen into shyness, and the light would slip out of them, and the naturalness, so that all the camera saw, and therefore all it could show, was a succession of blanks. Then, too, when our artist friend was with us, we were in the grasp of an epidemic of cholera. Morning and evening, and sometimes into the night, we were tending the sick and dying in the village, and in the interval between we had little heart for photographs. But the visit of a real photographer is a rare event in Dohnavur, and we forced ourselves to try to take advantage of it. Remembering our difficulties, we wonder we got anything at all, and we hope that stranger eyes will be kind. Often when we looked at the pretty little reversed picture in the camera with its delicate coloring and the grace of movement, we have wished that we could send it as we saw it, all living and true. The photos were taken in the open air. Underfoot was soft terracotta-colored sand, overhead the cloudless blue. In such a setting, the baby pictures look their brightest, something very different from these dull copies in sepia. An oriental scene in print always looks sorry for itself and quite apologetic. It knows it is almost a farce and very flat and poor. Then there were difficulties connected with character. Our photographer was more accustomed to the dignified ways of mountains than to the extremely restless habit of children, and he never could understand why they would not sit for him as the mountains sat, and let him focus them comfortably. The babies looked at things from an opposite point of view, and strongly objected to delays and leisureliness of every description. Sometimes when the focusing process promised to be much prolonged, we put a child we did not wish to photograph in the place of one upon whom we had designs, and then, at the last moment, exchanged her. But the baby thus beguiled seemed to divine our purpose, and resenting such ensnarements, would promptly wriggle out of focus. It was like trying to observe some active animalculae under a high power. The microscope is perfect. The creatures are entrapped in a drop of water on the slide, but the game is not won by any means. Sometimes, after spoiling more plates than was convenient, our artist almost gave up in despair. But he never quite gave up, and we owe what we have to his infinite patience. Pyârie was the most troublesome of these small sitters, though she was old enough to know better. My mother was with us when she came to us, a tiny babe and very delicate. She had loved her and helped to nurse her, and so we wanted a happy photograph for her sake. But nothing was farther from Pyârie's intentions, and instead of smiling, she scowled. Our first attempt was in the compound, where a bullock bandy stood. Pyârie and Vinitha, a little girl of about the same age, were very pleased to climb over the pole and untwist the rope and play seesaw, but when the objectionable camera appeared, they stared at it with aversion, and no amount of coaxing would persuade Pyârie to smile. "Can't you do something to improve her expression?" inquired the photographer, emerging from his black hood. Then someone said in desperation, "Do smile, you little Turk!" Vinitha, about whose expression we were not concerned, obediently smiled, but Pyârie looked thunderclouds and turned her head away. She was caught before she turned, poor dear, so that the photograph was a failure. Once again our kind friend tried. This time he gave her a doll. Pyârie is most motherly. She is usually tender and loving with dolls, and we hoped for a sweet expression. But in this we were disappointed. She accepted the doll, a beautiful thing with a good constitution and imperturbable temper, and she looked it straight in the face, a rag face painted, smiling as we wanted her to smile. Then she smote it, and she scolded it, and called for a stick, and whacked it, and called for a bigger stick, and repeated the performance. Finally she stopped, laid the doll upon the step, sat down on it, and smiled. But she was hopelessly out of focus by this time, and it was weary work getting her in. She smiled during the process in a perfectly exasperating manner, but the moment all was ready, she suddenly wriggled out, and when invited to go in again, she shook her head decidedly, and pointing to the camera with its glaring glass eye, covered at that moment with its cloth, she remarked, "Naughty, naughty!" and we had to give her up. Perhaps she would be happier in someone's arms, next suggested the long-suffering artist. And so one morning, just after her bath, she was caught up, sweet and smiling, and played with till the peals of merry laughter assured us of an easy victory. But the camera was no sooner seen stalking round the nursery than suspicions filled Pyre's breast. That thing again! And the photograph taken under such circumstances is left to speak for itself. Why did it follow her everywhere? Life, haunted by a camera, was not worth living, in which sentiment some of us heartily concur. Once an attempt was made when Pyre and 2 other little girls were busily playing on the doorstep. Pyre soon perceived and expressed her opinion about the fraud, for the camera's stealthy approach could not be kept from the children. "Disgusting," she remarked in explicit young Tamil, and looked disgusted. The photograph which resulted was perfect in detail, of little rounded limb and curly head, but it was lamentable as regards expression. So once more our persevering friend tried to catch her unawares. He showed us the result at breakfast in the shape of a negative which we recognized as Pyre. He seemed very pleased. "Look at the pose," he said. There was a pose, certainly, but where was the smile? Pyre's one idea had evidently been to ward off something or someone, and our artist explained it by saying that in despair of getting her quiet for 1 second, he had directed his servant to climb an almost overhanging tree, and the child apparently thought he was going to tumble on the top of her, and objected. I got another of her smiling beautifully, but the plate is cracked, we were told, after the table had admired the pose. That is a way plates have. The one you most want cracks. Poor little Pyre. We sometimes fear lest her pose should be too true of her. She takes life hardly, and often protests, "I want a birthday." This was only yesterday, when everyone was rejoicing over a birthday jubilation. Pyre alone was sorrowful. She stood by her poor little lonely self, with her head thrown back and her mouth wide open, and her tears ran into her open mouth as she wailed, "Ay-yo, ay-yo! Alas, alas, I want a birthday!" But she is such a loving child, so loyal to her own, and so unselfish to all younger things, that we hope for her more than we fear. And yet underneath there is a fear. We ask those who can understand to remember this little one sometimes, for the world is not always kind to its poor little foolish Pyres. I am writing in the afternoon, and 2 little people are playing on the floor. One has a picture book, and the other is looking eagerly as she turns the pages and questions, "What is it? What is it?" I notice it is always Pyre who asks the question, and Vinitha who answers it. "It is a cow. It is a cat." "Why don't you let Vinitha ask you what it is?" I suggest. But Pyre continues as before. "What is it? What is it?" varied by, "What color is it? What shape is it? Who made it?" And the mischief in her eyes, would that our artist could have caught it, explains the game. It is decidedly better to be teacher than scholar, because suitable expressions can cover all ignorance. Pyre has not been to the kindergarten of late, and has reason to fear Vinitha is somewhat ahead of her, so she ignores my proposals and continues her safe questions. We sometimes think we shall one night be heard talking in our sleep, and the burden of our conversation will be always, "What is it? What color is it? What shape is it? Who made it?" End of chapter 4.